All right, so today as we're going to be moving now back in time out of the 21st century, back into the 15th century, before we can fully start talking about that, we need to understand where the Renaissance came out of, and to understand that we need to understand why did the Middle Ages come to an end. So the first question I want us to think about is how could famine and the Black Death actually in a way be positive, which sounds kind of strange because you wouldn't think the Black Plague would be something that could be considered positive. But so the Black Death kind of comes into Europe between 1347 and 1351. Just keep in mind that, the Black Death starts in China and spreads along the trade routes and then winds up in Europe by 1347. So a couple of things to understand prior to the Black Plague coming in and hitting is that there was overpopulation in Europe. Between 1000 and 1300. The population of Europe doubled. Now, back then, you also have to remember that farming methods were still very primitive. They were still using, 2-field systems and 3-field systems, and agricultural yields were not very high. So it was very hard for them to support the population as it was. The average European would face extreme hunger at least once in their 35-year lifespan. So average life expectancy was 35 years. And at some point in that life, you're going to experiencing an issue where you might actually, in fact, die. So between 1315 and 1317, there was a pretty bad famine. It was a series of bad harvests. The cold, wet weather, there was a shift in climate, and the cold, wet weather made the land unusable. And we see that there was huge amounts of crop failures, and as a result, the cities couldn't get their food. It says here as many as 15% of the peasants in some English villages died as a result of this famine, and the consequence of this was starvation. Starvation was poverty, and basically it made people very susceptible to when the disease did come into Europe. You're already coming into a population that has already been severely weakened and malnourished. Also, trade declined as a result of this famine, and the banking system just in general was under stress. So in 1347, the Black Plague reaches Constantinople, the city of Constantinople. And this happens, and I'll just point out to you. See if it'll work. That right there is the city of Constantinople. So in 1347, the plague comes into the city of Constantinople from Asia. Then from Constantinople, because of, you could see here on this map, all of the various different trade routes, it then eventually comes into Italy. Genoa, Messina in Sicily, Genoa, Venice, Ragusa, and then it goes to Marseille, Barcelona. So all of the Mediterranean seacoast towns, you basically had examples of what they refer to as ghost ships. Like ships would arrive, and almost at that point, almost everyone has died on the ship because of the plague. So within 4 years, a third of the population of Europe dies. Really, it's the areas that are on the major trade routes. So the areas of like Eastern Europe, which really was kind of like not part of any of these trade routes of the late Middle Ages, were pretty much untouched by the plague. So within 4 years, a third of the population died. And then outbreaks are going to continue about roughly every decade until the 18th century. And since people did not have a hereditary immunity to this, it was basically a check on the population. And it was believed that it was spread by fleas, that then the fleas would drink rat's blood, or now they actually think it's gerbil blood, that would carry the bacteria would multiply in the flea's gut. The flea then would bite the human, regurgitate some of the blood into the human wound, and then the human being would be infected. Now, that's what we know now from, modern epidemiology. We understand how diseases spread. The symptoms would be this, what was called a bubble. You'd see it here on this girl's neck. Hold on one second. You can see it here, see it on her neck. And the reason why it's called the Black Plague, it's an infection of the lymph nodes. So you'd get these black bubbles that were kind of filled with blood and pus, and that's why they would look black. In areas like your neck, your underarms, your groin area, because it was the lymph nodes. And then also, it would begin, you'd see here the bottom picture, the blood begins to pool in your fingertips. So what also led to, originally it started by fleas, Eventually, it mutates and becomes the pneumonic plague. And once it's the pneumonic plague and no longer the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague was spread by coughing. Once you were infected, you were dead in about 3 days. And the more crowded conditions, the more vulnerable you were. So people living in the cities, and medieval cities were notoriously unsanitary. It just made it easier for the disease to spread. Many, like the aristocracy, even, royal families in some instances, the church, would flee into the countryside, and many of them would kind of be safe because they would get away from the centers of population. But they didn't really know how to treat it. So they would try to lance it. They would try to come up with all these strange ways to try to fix it, but no one really knew how to treat it. And not only did they not know how to treat it, they didn't understand why it spreads. Like I said, we understand now why it spread, but back then they did not. So some thought it was corruption in the atmosphere. Others thought it was poisonous fumes from earthquakes. Some people became extremely religious in response to this, and really kind of turned to prayer. Some also turned to kind of more extreme forms, like the flagellants. So the flagellants would inflict penance upon themselves. They felt that God was bringing the plague as punishment for people's sins. So they would beat themselves, and they would travel from village to village, beating themselves. And in essence, what they did was inadvertently spread the disease. Some blamed the Jews, and this became a series of persecution against the Jews. This is actually where the practice of marking off who is Jewish, they would wear the golden circle. They would have to wear specific hats, and they were basically pogroms that were placed against the Jews because the Jews were seen as outsiders. They were not part of the society, and then they were blamed for this. And they were basically in some ways incited by the flagellants, which were essentially religious extremists. Some people became ultra-moral and religious. Others became very promiscuous. So a lot of people took on the attitude, well, death is coming anyway, so I might as well enjoy it while we can. So there was a lot of differing responses to the plague. Culture became very kind of obsessed with death. Okay, so this section, this is actually from Boccaccio's Decameron. We may be reading this in class if we have time, or parts of it. So it says, neither physicians nor medicines were effective, whether because these illnesses were previously unknown or because physicians had not previously studied them, there seemed to be no cure. There was such a fear that no one seemed to know what to do. When it took hold of a house, it often happened that no one remained who had not died. And it was not just men and women who died, but even sentient animals died. Dogs, cats, chickens, oxen, donkeys, sheep showed the same symptoms and died of the same disease. And almost none, or very few, who showed the symptoms were cured. The symptoms were the following: a boo-boo in the groin, where the thigh meets the trunk, or a small swelling under the armpit, sudden fever, spitting blood and saliva, and no one who spit blood survived it. It was such a frightful thing that when it got into a house, as it was said, no one remained. Frightened people abandoned the house and fled to another. So we see like a breakdown in family. So family members stopped even caring for their sick family members. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk, and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. That's a very famous quote from Boccaccio's the Decameron, which is a story of a bunch of nobility that flee Florence from the plague and are kind of hanging out and like telling stories to kind of like entertain and pass the time as they're kind of like exiled from the plague. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open streets, others dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. Consecrated churchyards did not suffice for the burial of the vast multitude of bodies, which were heaped by the hundreds in vast trenches, like goods in a ship hold and covered with little earth. So like I said, people basically became obsessed with death. So people would come... a lot of the art kind of reflects this kind of like skeletons and death and what's called the Danse Macabre, dance of death. There again is that quote from Boccaccio, the victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors. And that's the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. So doctors would try to treat patients by lancing or leeching, and they would arrive with these strange kind of hats and contraptions on, thinking that they smelt fresh herbs or that they wouldn't get infected with disease. You can also see how it's spread out. And then you could also see the areas like Poland, for instance, that had very few plague deaths because they really weren't a part of the major trade routes in Europe at the time. There's another little theme. So, and this is a little ditty. A sickly season, the merchant said, the town I left was filled with dead, and everywhere these queer red flies crawled upon the corpses' eyes, eating them away. Fair make you sick, the merchant said. They crawled upon the wine and bread, pale priests with oil and books, bulging eyes and crazy looks, dropping like flies. I had to laugh, the merchant said. The doctors purged and dosed and bled, and proved through solemn disputation the cause lay in some constellation, and then they began to die. First they sneezed, the merchant said, and then they turned the brightest red, begged for water, then fell back, with bulging eyes and face turned black. They waited for the flies. I don't know why my dog is going crazy. I apologize. I came away, the merchant said. You can't do business with the dead. So I came here to ply my trade. You'll soon find this to be a fine brocade. And then he sneezed. So kind of this idea that as the merchants, the traveling merchants would travel from village to village, selling their wares, they inadvertently also spread the plague. So the mortality rates is between 35 to 70%. So some areas literally were completely depopulated from the plague, and the estimates are about 25 million in Europe. And I don't know why my dog's going crazy. I'm sorry. And in some other places, total overall, including the death toll in Asia, you're looking at upwards of 75 million people that died of the plague. So some things that happened as a result of this, that was actually kind of in somewhat ways good. The population decline relieved the pressure on land that had been building. So food prices and rents began to fall. Peasants gained access to land that they inherited from dead relatives. And there was also a labor shortage, so wages increased. Communities were abandoned. People began looking for jobs. And so as a result of this, we see an end of the isolation of the villages. So in the medieval times, people pretty much stayed in their village and never left the village. But now you see that people begin to leave their village, travel looking for places because they've lost their family or they're afraid of the plague. Landowners began to lose money and they had to sell their land. And we see a shift away from serfdom and a movement towards private ownership and a weakening of feudal ties. So to maintain their fortunes, the nobles convinced the kings to try to reinstate feudal law and economic opportunity for the peasants. They tried to restrict peasant movement. And what this led to was peasant revolts that broke out in France and England and Germany. And eventually the peasants did get to have their freedom of movement. In addition, the nobles and the church decreased in power because a lot of ways the church decreased in power because the church was seen as not really doing much to help the people because they were more concerned about themselves and about dying that they kind of abandoned their flock in essence. So the next question, the next thing that kind of is leading to the end of the Middle Ages was the 100 Years' War. So how did the 100 Years' War lead to the rise of nation states in France and England? So very briefly, the causes of the 100 Years' War. So first off, there was a controversy over who should be the next French king. The French nobility selected a man named Philip of Valois, who was a cousin of the last king. He founded a new French dynasty that's going to rule France through the 16th century. He was chosen by the French nobles in preference to King Edward III of England, whose mother was the daughter of the late King Edward IV. So this dispute is over who should be the next King of England. Should it be Philip of Valois or should it be Edward III, who also happens to be King of England? So in 1340, Edward is going to claim the title King of France. And this all starts when the king dies without an heir, basically, the French king. The other issue is French lands belonging to British kings. So because King William, King William of Normandy? Oh, my Lord. William the Conqueror. Yeah, William the Conqueror, who was William of Normandy, was originally from France, and he comes and conquers England, becomes King of England. The English crown still had holdings in France. So that meant that the English king was vassal to the French king because of these lands in France. And so the French wanted to take these lands back. The other issue is the issue of Flanders. Flanders is in north of France. It was a big area for the wool industry, and the Flemish wanted its independence from France, and they looked to England for help. And then finally, a struggle for national identity. So now one thing to keep in mind about France prior to the 100 Years' War is that France was not a united country before the war began. The king really is only controlling about half the land. So everything in here that's in orange is land that's controlled by the French king. Brittany, Burgundy, Blois, all those other places, those are controlled by other nobles. And then the English own, a large section of southern France. So there was all these different issues. Now, when we actually see the war start, now this is the 100 Years' War, goes on for like 133 years. It's really not a constant series of war, not like anything like World War I or World War II. The war was really a series of short raids and expeditions with a few battles and then long periods of truces. And basically the strengths of each kind of dictated how this battle went. So the French advantages was that they had a population at this time about 16 million. They were about 3 times, basically their population was 3 times larger than the British, or the English, I should say. Not only that, but they were fighting on their own soil, which always gives them an advantage, even though at the first part of the war, the French actually did very badly. But France was very much richer and more populous than England, and they had a very large army, larger than the British army. But the advantage that the British had, first off, the British had better weapons. They had a better trained army. They had the longbow, which could pierce armor at 200 yards away. And so this kind of gave them an advantage, even though they were outnumbered in almost every battle. But their most successful strategies were to avoid active pitched battles, avoid one-on-one battles with the French, engage in quick, profitable raids, steal what you can, destroy everything else, capture enemy knights, and hold them for ransom. That was basically what they did. And like I said before, the longbow was a big thing that the British had, like I said, that could pierce an armor at 200 yards away. And the longbow could be fired more rapidly, about 6 arrows a minute, than the crossbow. So here you can see some of the longbow being used in the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. So in the beginning of the war, the English were actually winning. Part of the reason was because there was internal fighting within France itself. England itself was a more centralized state. The English crown had more centralized power over the country. The French needed money, so they depreciated their currency. They borrowed from Italian banks, and the Estates General, same Estates General in the French Revolution, was called to levy taxes. And the nobles used this opportunity to increase their rights and privileges. Kind of like, okay, well, we'll give you what you want, we'll give you the taxes, but we need more power, we need no rights and privileges. So basically, France is being made to be even weaker as a result of the war, or the French crown. Now, England had a much better trained army, which kind of gave them an advantage, and which is why they had some early victories. They also were using the cannon, which also gave them some advantages. You can see images of the cannon being used. Also, there was the Flemish, who did not like the French, recognized Edward as king. And basically, the nobles in France were each trying to advance different goals. And so they were not united. So that's why things were going like this. So now also notice that this war goes on for a very long time, so the monarchs change. So the English are going to wind up capturing the French king. France, like I said, was ruled by the Estates General, and they were using this to basically take power from the king. In 1358, in the confusion and unrest growing at the French disaster at Poitiers, this royal movement began. It was a response to the long-standing economic and political grievances in the countryside that was made worse by warfare, and the rebels were defeated by aristocratic armies. So in the middle of the French trying to fight the English, you have basically a revolt going on in France. Now, there also was trouble in England. So there was a peasant revolt in 1381 in England that was put down by King Richard II. After charges of tyranny, Richard II was forced to abdicate in 1300. Parliament elects Henry IV, the first to rule from the House of Lancaster. Henry avoided war taxes, and he was careful not to alienate the nobility. Therefore, he signs a truce, ending the French and British hostilities for the time being. Then we have King Henry V. He renewed his family's claim to the French throne. At Agincourt in 1415, the English, led by Henry, goads the larger French army into attacking a fortified English position. With the aids of the Dukes of Burgundy, Henry gains control over Normandy, Paris, and northern France. Now, Burgundy is a pretty large kingdom within France today. It's parts of Germany, it's parts of Belgium, the Netherlands. But the Burgundian kingdom was kind of in challenge to the French, and the Burgundians were willing to support the British over the French. So we see that this kind of also adds to the general confusion. So also during this time, which leads up to the Treaty of Troyes, so don't write this down quite yet, but there was uprisings in Spain, and they looked to France for help. So France set their army, since they had this large army that they had raised to fight the English, and they didn't really have anything to do with. They didn't really have anything to do. The English were called in to fight on the other side. So now we see the British and the French kind of fighting by proxy in Spain. The English king is going to tax the people in Guyenne, which is one of their regions in France, to fund the war in Spain. But for the next 35 years or so, we're going to have a stalemate. And there's going to be internal disorder basically in both countries until, like I said, Henry V kind of gets back involved again, invades France in 1415. And England is successful in this phase, ending in the Treaty of Troyes. So Charles VI's son, the future Charles VII, was declared illegitimate and disinherited. As a result of this, Henry V marries Catherine, the daughter of Charles VI. Henry was declared the legitimate heir to the French throne. Seemed like the English were going to wind up being victorious in the 100 Years' War. But both Charles VI and Henry V died in 1422. Henry's son, Henry VI, was a baby, and he was to inherit both thrones, but he's a baby. So that also creates a large problem. So here we can see, though, at the height of English dominance, this is all of the land that England is managing to control in France. Now, the French are going to take back the land, and part of the reason why they're going to be able to do that is because of a young girl named Joan of Arc. So the two kings' deaths ushered in the final stage of the 100 Years' War. So even though in 1428 the military and political power seemed kind of to be in the British hands, the French are going to reverse the situation. In 1429, with the aid of Joan of Arc, the French king Charles VII was able to raise the English siege of Orleans, and they were able to kind of begin the reconquest of France. Now, the thing about Joan of Arc, who today is the patron saint of France, she's a source of inspiration and national identity and self-confidence. Didn't always go that way. She was the daughter of prosperous peasants from the area of Burgundy that had suffered under the British. She believed that she heard visions and voices from various different saints that told her to go to the king and insist him in driving out the British. She goes to the king, or goes to Charles, convinces him that she needs to lead an army. She dressed like a man so she could ride a horse and fight, and she was basically a very charismatic military leader. So here we can see her as a feminist symbol. Here we can see another image. Yet another image. Now, what happened to Joan of Arc was kind of really quite sad. She's captured by the British. She's burned as a witch for heresy by the English on May 30th, 1431. Part of it is believed that she kind of almost became like a problem for the French because Charles didn't really do anything to help her. And supposedly the reason why she got captured is because the army was fleeing into, I forget what town, the drawbridge was going up, and somehow she didn't get in before the drawbridge went up. And she gets captured and she gets burned as a heretic. They tried to get her to say something wrong about the church, to speak out against the church. She couldn't. She knew her Bible frontwards and backwards. She was on with her religious knowledge. So what they actually got her on was for dressing like a man, which was considered an act of heresy by a female at the time. But like I said, she rode a horse, so she had to wear pants. And so that's actually ultimately what she was convicted of. So how does this whole war come to an end? So despite Joan's capture, the French advance continues. By 1450, the English had lost all of their major centers except for the port of Calais. In 1453, the French armies capture an English-held fortress, and this was the last battle of the war. This war does not end in a treaty, but in a cessation of fighting. So what the heck does this even mean for anything? What this means is that by the end of this time period, France is a united country. France is ruled by a strong monarch, which it was not before. So this we see really is the consolidation of France. Burgundy finally being kind of subdued, Flanders kind of finally being subdued, and France then beginning to become a major unified power in Europe, which also kind of helps bring about the end of the Middle Ages, because you no longer have these weak, decentralized kingdoms. So the last question, or second to last question, sorry, how did the church begin to lose prestige? So during the Middle Ages, we refer to the Middle Ages as the Age of Faith. This is when the church had the most power. So Pope Innocent II had been strengthening the church politically, but he had weakened it spiritually. So under Pope Innocent II, you kind of see the church at its most powerful during the Middle Ages as far as political power. In the 13th century, the papacy had their own laws, their own courts, their own bureaucracy, and they were very preoccupied with more secular ideas. And a lot of critics began to call the goal for the church to kind of pull itself out of all this secular politics and become more simple. A lot of people felt that the cardinals were too politicized. And also the power of the kings during this time period is beginning to become more centralized and really could not be told by the Pope what to do. So one example is this kind of struggle between the Pope and the king is Pope Boniface VIII. I'll write that for you because I don't think you know how to spell that. Now, he's Pope from 1294 to 1303. And during that time, he was in constant conflict with kings. He tried to prevent the kings from taxing the clergy. Philip the Fair of France winds up cutting off the clergy from all money in France. They won't let anybody pay any money to the church. In August of 1303, the army came to the papal retreat, basically like their summer palace. He was badly beaten. The people managed to save him, but he actually soon died after. So basically the King of France had him killed. Then we have what's known as, which is another weakening of the church, is something that's known as the Avignon papacy. So I'll write that down for you as well. So Avignon is a city in France. So there's going to be a point in the history, in the history of the Pope, that from 1309 to 1377, the popes are going to be hanging out in France and Avignon instead of in Rome. So basically the papacy and the kings of Europe were in a power struggle. They're having particular disagreements with the kings of France. In 1309, Pope Clement, and why is my pen? Pope Clement V moves the court from Rome to Avignon in 1309. He was a former bishop of Bordeaux, so he was French, and he was forced to take back the gains that Boniface had tried to get from the kings. Basically, he said Rome was filled with enemies to the Pope, and basically it wasn't safe for the Pope to be in Rome. He basically gives into pressure from King Philip of France. The papacy loses a great deal of power, and they're really never a strong state again after this point. The Avignon papacy has a reputation for materialism, for political scheming. Most of the cardinals were French, so it was seen as being very kind of corrupt in that respect. This is when the selling of indulgences begin, which is what leads to the Protestant Reformation. This is also when the ideas of purgatory was established, which kind of plays in well for the ideas of indulgences. In the late 14th century, France, Germany, and England all began to restrict papal jurisdiction and taxation. England associated the Pope with France, with French, because the popes were living in France, and they were still angry with France over the 100 Years' War. Charles VII of France gets the church to agree to something called the Pragmatic sanction of, where did I lose it? Of Bourges. And what this means is that Charles VII got the right of the French church to elect their own clergy without dealing with the Pope. So we see that there's kind of like the kings are beginning to take power. In England, you have a splinter group, which actually is kind of a predecessor to the Protestants, called the Lollards, begin to develop. The Lollards were led by John Wycliffe in England. And basically they felt that personal merit should be the basis for religious authority. They challenged the infallibility of the Pope, basically meaning that the Pope knows everything and can never be wrong. They challenged the sale of indulgences, challenged the authority of the scripture, the concept of transubstantiation, which is the belief, the Catholic belief that when you take the Holy Communion, which is the bread and the wine, that you're actually taking in the body and blood of Christ. He advocated preaching in English rather than Latin. So that was the vernacular. Vernacular is the language of the people. So he basically all services would be preached in Latin, and he said no, they should be preached in the language of the people. So he would preach in English, and a lot of his arguments are going to be used by the Protestants later. Like Martin Luther is going to take on a lot of his ideas. It's going to be the basis of the English Reformation. He was declared a heretic, and it was considered a capital offense to practice the ideas of the Lollards in 1401. And any English peasant uprisings that were happening during this time were seen as subversive to the church. There was another group that began to be formed that also was beginning to challenge the ideas of the church. You can actually see this is the burning of the Lollards. And that was the ideas of a man named John Huss, or actually Jan Hus. Now, there was, and his followers were referred to as the Hussites. Now, this was in Prague, which was referred to as Bohemia during this time period. The Queen of England was actually from Prague, so that's why there was a lot of communication between England and Bohemia at this point. So that's why Jan Hus, I should say, was actually influenced by Wycliffe. So he also was against transubstantiation. I'll spell that for you. And this is this belief that when you take the bread and the wine during Holy Communion in the Mass, that you're actually taking in the body and blood of Christ. So he was against transubstantiation. He also agreed with the vernacular translations of the Bible. He was against the traditional ceremonies and the superstitious practices. He's excommunicated. All of Prague is put under an interdict because he had so many followers, which means, in essence, the whole city cannot get the sacrament. So the whole city is almost like excommunicated. So he was arrested and he was burned at the stake. And this sparked fierce revolts. And actually, it's kind of a sad story because Jan Hus was promised safe passage to kind of meet with the Pope and kind of answer to his ideas and charges against the church, and they used it as a trick, and then they captured him and they burned him at the stake. Then the final thing that really hurts the church, and here you can see this is the Jan Hus being burned. But one of the final things that really kind of affected the church was something that was called the Great Schism. And my pen is not working. This is the last thing I promised, because I know you're probably all flipping out with how long this is. So the Great Schism lasts from 1378 to 1417. So Pope Gregory XI decides to return the papacy to Rome. So take it out of Avignon, bring it back to Rome. Pope Urban VI wanted to try to reform basically the College of the Cardinals because it was all controlled by the French. An Italian was elected to be Pope. And he wanted to challenge the power of the cardinals. Now, most of the cardinals were French, and they did not like this. So the cardinals and King Charles of France said, we want the papacy under the control of France. So the French cardinal said, basically, we don't agree with this Pope, Pope Urban VI, that was elected to be Pope. We feel we were in fear of our lives when we voted for Urban, so therefore he's not a true Pope. We elect Pope Clement VII of of France. So they basically were divided along political lines. England and their allies supported Urban, France and her allies supported Clement. So in 1409, we have the Council of Pisa, because now basically you had two popes. You had two popes who both said they were the true pope, and the pope is supposed to be the representative of God, chosen by God. So now how can you have two people chosen by God? So at the Council of Pisa in 1409, the cardinals from both popes convened a council. They decided, all right, we need to get rid of both of these popes, both Urban and Clement. We need to come up with a new pope, Pope Alexander V. The problem is the other two popes would not step down, so now you had three popes. So the Council of Constance, I believe is a city in Germany. The Council of Constance in 1414, I don't know why I wrote that wrong, 1414, ended the schism. So basically they said that this council, which was made up of cardinals, they asserted supremacy. They elected another pope, Martin V, and basically secular control over the churches increased as a result of this. And this made people really begin to question the authority and the sanctity of the church. And this is all going to inadvertently lead to the Reformation. And it's also going to lead to the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is a more secular movement, kind of moving away from religion and the power of the church. Which takes us to the summary question: what forces are leading to the end of the Middle Ages? I'm sorry this is so long, but there's a lot of stuff I need to get through. I'll see you in class. Have a good night.